High above the jagged, black-ribbed peaks of Nazi-occupied Norway, a small group of men huddled inside the vibrating, oil-scented belly of a British Sterling bomber. It was February 1943. Outside, a blinding blizzard had turned the world into a chaotic swirl of white and gray, masking the lethal terrain of the Hardanger Plateau. These men weren't just soldiers. They were ghosts on skis, carrying a burden that weighed heavier than the plastic explosives strapped to their backs. They knew a terrifying truth that the rest of the world hadn't yet realized. If they failed tonight, the most devastating weapon in human history would fall into the hands of Adolf Hitler. This is the story of Operation Gunnerside, a mission so daring and so improbable that it sounds like the fever dream of a Hollywood screenwriter. But every heartbeat of this story is true. It is the narrative of how a handful of Norwegian commandos skied through the gates of hell to save the world from an atomic nightmare. To understand why these men were jumping into a frozen wasteland, we have to look at a substance that sounds unremarkable, but was, at the time, the most valuable liquid on the planet: heavy water. In the early 1940s, the secret race for the atomic bomb had begun in earnest. Scientists across the globe, from the Manhattan Project in America to the Uranium Club in Berlin, realized that splitting the atom could release an energy so vast it could level entire cities in a single heartbeat. But there was a catch. To control that energy, you needed a moderator, a substance to slow down neutrons so a sustained chain reaction could occur. While the Americans were betting on graphite, the Germans were putting all their chips on deuterium oxide, or heavy water. It looks like regular water, it tastes like regular water, but it's slightly denser. And in the hands of a Nazi physicist, it was the key to the ultimate weapon. And there was only one place in the entire world that produced it on an industrial scale: the Vemork hydroelectric plant. Imagine a fortress of concrete and steel, perched like a vulture on a sheer 700-foot cliff in the remote valley of Telemark. It was a marvel of engineering, but by 1942, it had become a temple of doom. The Nazis had seized the plant in 1940, immediately ordering a massive increase in production. British intelligence watched with growing dread as shipments of the precious liquid began moving toward German laboratories. They knew the math. If Hitler's scientists cracked the code, the war would be over before the Allies even crossed the English Channel. London, Washington, Moscow, they could all be erased in a single flash of light. Vemork became the most important target in the world, but it was also the most unreachable. It was surrounded by impassable mountains, guarded by elite German mountain troops, and accessible only by a single narrow suspension bridge hanging over a 300-foot gorge. It was, quite literally, a fortress of ice. The British had tried to take it out once before, and the result was a tragedy that still haunted the halls of the Special Operations Executive in London. In late 1942, they launched Operation Freshman. It was a bold plan, using gliders to land specialized British paratroopers. It was a catastrophe of the highest order. The gliders, caught in the treacherous Norwegian winds, crashed into the mountains. Those who didn't die in the impact were hunted down by the Gestapo. Under Hitler's infamous Commando Order, they were tortured and executed. None returned. The mission had failed. And worse, the Germans were now wide awake. They doubled the defenses. They laid minefields, installed massive searchlights, and reinforced the garrison with more troops. The Allies couldn't send another army. The Germans would see them coming for miles. They needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. They needed the Norwegians, men who had been born with skis on their feet, who moved through the thin, freezing air of the plateau as if it were a summer breeze. The plan relied on two groups. First, an advance team code-named Grouse had been dropped months earlier to scout the plant. Their survival is a story of its own. For months, they lived in a primitive stone hut on the plateau, enduring temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. When their food ran out, they survived on reindeer moss and the contents of a reindeer's stomach to get the vitamins they needed. They were skeletal, frostbitten, and exhausted, but they never left their post. In February 1943, the six-man sabotage team, led by a 23-year-old named Joachim Runneberg, finally parachuted in to join them. When the two groups met in that tiny, flickering hut, they didn't look like the world's last hope. They looked like ghosts, but their resolve was made of iron. Runneberg was young, but he was a master of explosives and a man of few words. He knew the odds. They had no support, no extraction plan, and no hope of rescue. If they were caught, they carried cyanide pills in their pockets to ensure the Gestapo couldn't break them. The night of the raid, February 27th, was a descent into the impossible. Runneberg and his team looked at the suspension bridge, the only way in, and saw the German machine gun nests. A direct assault was suicide. So, they did what the Nazis deemed physically impossible. They decided to descend to the very bottom of the frozen gorge, cross the rushing, half-frozen Mona River at the base, and then climb the sheer, 300-foot rock face on the other side to slip into the plant through a back gate. The descent was a nightmare of slick ice and vertical drops. Every time a boot slipped or a piece of gear clattered against a rock, they froze, waiting for the sound of a German alarm. At the bottom, the roar of the river was deafening. They picked their way across shifting ice floes, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Then came the climb. Using their bare hands and knives, they clawed at frozen rock and tufts of dead grass, hauling themselves up the cliffside. Their muscles were screaming, their fingers were numb, but the thought of what was at the top kept them moving. When they finally crested the ledge, they were standing right outside the plant's perimeter. They could see the German sentries just yards away, their silhouettes etched against the glow of the searchlights. Runneberg checked his watch. It was time. Using heavy-duty wire cutters, they snipped through the perimeter fence with agonizing slowness. Runneberg and his small demolition team split off from the cover group. They couldn't use the doors. They were bolted shut. Their only way in was a narrow, dark cable tunnel, a hole barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. One by one, they slid into the dark, mechanical guts of the factory. The air inside was different. It smelled of ozone, grease, and the hum of massive turbines. They emerged into the heavy water room, a forest of steel pipes and high-concentration cells. It was strangely quiet. A lone Norwegian night watchman looked up, his eyes widening in shock at the sight of masked, armed men appearing like phantoms from the walls. Runneberg put a finger to his lips. In a surreal moment of humanity, the watchman realized he'd misplaced his glasses in his panic. Runneberg, realizing the man would be helpless without them, actually stopped to help him find his glasses before lighting the fuses. The tension was suffocating. Runneberg shortened the fuses from 2 minutes to 30 seconds. He wanted to make sure they heard the blast before the Germans could intervene. He gave the watchman a 10-second head start, and then lit the spark. The commandos scrambled back through the tunnel, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They were halfway across the courtyard when it happened. Not a massive Hollywood explosion that leveled the building, but a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the ground. It was a surgical strike. The blast shattered the stainless steel tanks, and hundreds of gallons of the world's most expensive liquid began spiraling down the floor drains, lost forever. The sirens began to wail, a high-pitched scream that cut through the mountain silence. German soldiers poured out of the barracks, flashlights dancing frantically across the snow. But the Norwegians were already ghosts again. They didn't run for the bridge. They dove back into the gorge, sliding down the cliffside in a blur of white and shadow. By the time the German commander reached the heavy water room and saw the ruined equipment, The saboteurs were miles away. General von Falkenhorst, the commander of German forces in Norway, would later stand in that ruined room and describe it as the finest coup he had ever seen in the history of warfare. But the mission wasn't over. Now, they had to escape a country crawling with 10,000 angry Nazi soldiers. The team split up. Runneberg and 4 others began a journey that remains a legend in military history. A 300-mile ski trek across the frozen wilderness toward the safety of neutral Sweden. They traveled through blizzards that would have killed an ordinary man in an hour. They slept in the snow, survived on nothing, and moved with a speed that baffled their pursuers. The sabotage at Vemork didn't just destroy a factory, it fractured the Nazi nuclear program beyond repair. The Germans tried to rebuild, but the momentum was gone. A year later, when they tried to ship the remaining stocks of heavy water to Germany, the resistance was waiting again. They placed a bomb on the ferry, the SF Hydro, and watched as it sank into the depths of a Norwegian fjord, taking Hitler's atomic dreams to the bottom of the sea. Because of those 11 men on skis, the Allied forces landing on the beaches of Normandy didn't have to fear a nuclear strike. The world remained dark that night in Telemark, so that the rest of the world could have a future. Today, the ruins of the Vemork plant stand as a silent museum to a bravery that borders on the mythical. Joachim Runneberg, who lived to be 99 years old, never considered himself a hero. He said they were just doing a job. But as we look back at that sheer, frozen cliff and the weight of the mission they carried, we realize how thin the line was between our world and one of unimaginable shadow. They were the men who stopped the sun from being harnessed by the darkness. Through the ice, the fire, and the silence of the plateau, they carried the future on their shoulders, and they didn't falter. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button for The Lost Dispatch. We travel through the forgotten files of history to bring you the stories that were never meant to be told. What historical mystery should we decode next? Let us know in the comments.